The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the Hakone Maru as Captain Takeshi Yamamoto watched his crew secure the last of the cargo containers. The year was 1943, and the Pacific had become a graveyard for Japanese merchant vessels. Yet here he stood, preparing to lead another convoy through waters that grew more treacherous with each passing month. "Captain," First Officer Kenji Tanaka approached, his weathered face etched with concern. "The escort vessels report they're ready to depart, but Admiral Kusaka wishes to speak with you before we leave Rabaul." Yamamoto nodded, adjusting his cap against the tropical breeze. At 52, he had spent more years at sea than on land, and the war had aged him beyond his years. The Hakone Maru was his third command ship. The first two now rested on the ocean floor, claimed by American submarines that stalked Japanese shipping lanes like underwater wolves. The convoys stretched across the harbor, 12 merchant vessels of varying sizes, carrying everything from rice and medical supplies to ammunition and fuel for the beleaguered Japanese forces scattered across the Pacific Islands. 3 destroyers and 2 corvettes would escort them on their journey to reinforce the garrison at Bougainville. But Yamamoto knew that against the growing American air and naval power, even military escort offered little guarantee of survival. Admiral Shiro Kusaka's launch approached the Hakone Maru, cutting through the azure waters of Simpson Harbor. The admiral, a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his adherence to the ancient codes of Bushido, climbed aboard with the measured dignity of a samurai preparing for battle. "Captain Yamamoto," Kusaka's voice carried the weight of command and something else, a weariness that had become common among senior officers as Japan's strategic position grew increasingly desperate. "Walk with me." They moved to the stern, away from the bustling activity of departure preparations. Around them, the harbor hummed with the controlled chaos of a major convoy departure, sailors calling orders, engines warming, and the constant background noise of a military base preparing for another dangerous mission. "Captain," Kusaka began, his eyes scanning the assembled ships. "Tell me honestly, Captain, what do you think of our chances?" Yamamoto considered the question carefully. In the early days of the war, such directness from a senior officer would have been unthinkable. But 2 years of mounting losses had stripped away many of the polite fictions that once governed military discourse. "The Americans have grown stronger, Admiral. Their pilots are more experienced now, and they fly better aircraft than they did at Pearl Harbor. Our fighter cover will be limited once we leave the range of land-based aircraft." He paused, watching a group of young sailors loading supplies onto a nearby transport. Most were barely out of their teens. "But my crew is skilled and the convoy captains are experienced. We'll give them our best effort." Kusaka nodded slowly. "The Americans fight differently than they did at the beginning," he said quietly. "There was a time when we could count on their adherence to certain civilized conventions. They would attack our military vessels, yes, but there were lines they would not cross. Honor, Captain. Even enemies can recognize honor in each other. And now, Admiral?" "Now," Kusaka's voice trailed off as he watched a formation of Zero fighters pass overhead, heading out on patrol. "Now, I fear we are entering a phase of this war where honor becomes a luxury few can afford. The reports from our surviving convoy crews have become disturbing. The Americans seem to have developed a taste for what they call targets of opportunity. Everything that flies the rising sun becomes fair game." Yamamoto felt a chill despite the tropical warmth. He had heard whispers of merchant vessels being strafed after they had been abandoned, of lifeboats being targeted by American pilots. He had dismissed such stories as wartime propaganda or the confused accounts of traumatized survivors. Looking at Admiral Kusaka's expression, he began to wonder if his skepticism had been misplaced. "Sir, are you suggesting that the Americans would deliberately target survivors?" "I'm suggesting, Captain, that war has a way of stripping away the veneer of civilization from even the most honorable men. The Americans have suffered their own losses, their own humiliations. Pearl Harbor may have awakened their industrial might, but Bataan, Corregidor, the Arizona, these defeats have awakened something else, something darker." The two men stood in silence for a moment, each lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Kusaka straightened and returned to his official demeanor. "Your convoy will depart at 1400 hours. The route will take you north of Bougainville, then west to avoid the American air bases in the Solomons. Weather reports suggest you may encounter some tropical disturbances, which could provide natural cover from enemy aircraft." "Yes, sir. We'll make the best possible speed consistent with keeping the convoy together." "Captain," Kusaka's voice took on a more personal tone, "I want you to know that this convoy carries more than just supplies. In the holds of these ships are medicines that will save lives, food that will prevent starvation, and ammunition that may determine whether our men can hold their positions for another month. Every mile you travel brings hope to soldiers who believe they have been forgotten." Yamamoto bowed respectfully. "We will not fail them, Admiral." "I know you won't, Captain. But if the worst happens, if the convoy comes under attack and the situation becomes hopeless, remember that there is honor in survival as well as in death. Your men have families, and Japan will need experienced sailors if we are to have any hope of recovering from this war." The words hung in the air between them, laden with implications that neither man wanted to voice directly. They both knew that Japan's position in the Pacific was becoming increasingly desperate, that each convoy might be among the last to attempt these dangerous supply runs. After Admiral Kusaka departed, Yamamoto made his rounds of the ship, checking preparations and speaking with his crew. The Kobe Maru carried a complement of 43 men, most of whom had served with him through multiple voyages. There was Chief Engineer Hiroshi Sato, whose steady hand had kept their engines running through more than one emergency. Radio man Ichiro Nakamura, barely 20 but already a veteran of 6 convoy runs. Cook Yoshio Takahashi, whose ability to create nourishing meals from the most basic ingredients had earned him the crew's devotion. These were good men, Yamamoto reflected as he walked the familiar corridors of his ship. They deserved better than to face death in these increasingly hostile waters, but they would do their duty without complaint. It was the Japanese way, had always been the Japanese way. Gaman, enduring the seemingly unendurable with patience and dignity. At precisely 1400 hours, the convoy began its departure from Rabaul. The Kobe Maru took her position in the formation, surrounded by her sister ships like a school of fish seeking safety in numbers. The destroyer Yukikaze led the formation, her sleek lines cutting through the water with predatory grace. Behind her came the merchant vessels in 3 columns, with the remaining escorts taking positions on the flanks and rear. As the familiar coastline of New Britain fell away behind them, Yamamoto found himself thinking about Admiral Kusaka's words. Honor among enemies. It was a concept that seemed almost quaint in the context of total war. Yet it had once been real. In the early months of the conflict, there had been instances of American pilots saluting Japanese aircraft they had shot down, of both sides rescuing survivors from the sea regardless of nationality. Those days felt like ancient history now. The first day of the voyage passed without incident. The convoy maintained radio silence, communicating only through signal lamps when necessary. The weather was favorable, with scattered clouds that might provide some concealment from aerial reconnaissance. Yamamoto spent most of his time on the bridge, scanning the horizon for any sign of American patrol aircraft. Lieutenant Kenji Matsui, the ship's navigator, plotted their course with meticulous care. At 28, Matsui was young for his position, but his mathematical precision and calm demeanor under pressure had earned Yamamoto's complete confidence. The two men had developed an almost telepathic understanding during their months of sailing together. "Captain," Matsui said quietly, looking up from his charts. "At our current speed, we should reach the waters north of Bougainville by tomorrow evening. That's where we're most likely to encounter American air patrols. Any recommendations for our approach?" "The weather forecast suggests a squall line moving through the area around sunset tomorrow. If we can time our passage to coincide with the storms, it might mask our radar signatures and force any enemy aircraft to stay grounded." Yamamoto studied the charts, noting the careful notations Matsui had made regarding wind patterns, current variations, and known enemy patrol routes. "Make the necessary course adjustments to put us in position for that window. Signal the escort commander with our recommendation." As the evening approached, the convoy took on the timeless rhythm of ships at sea. Watch changes occurred with military precision, the crew settling into the familiar routines that had sustained merchant mariners for centuries. In the galley, Takahashi prepared rice and fish for the evening meal, while in the engine room, Chief Sato monitored the steady pulse of the diesel engines that drove them through the darkening Pacific. Yamamoto found himself unable to sleep that first night. He stood on the bridge wing, watching the phosphorescent wake of the ships ahead, listening to the sound of water against the hull. Somewhere out there, American submarines and aircraft were hunting for convoys exactly like this one. The hunter and the hunted, a deadly game played across thousands of miles of empty ocean. "Can't sleep either, Captain?" Yamamoto turned to find radioman Nakamura approaching with 2 cups of tea. The young man had volunteered for the night watch, though his shift wouldn't officially begin for another 2 hours. "Thank you, Nakamura. No, sleep seems to be avoiding me tonight." "My father was a fisherman," Nakamura said, settling beside his captain at the rail. "He used to tell me that the sea speaks to those who listen carefully. Sometimes it warns of storms, sometimes of good fishing. Tonight, what do you hear?" It was an unexpectedly philosophical question from someone so young, but Yamamoto had learned that war aged men quickly, forcing them to grapple with profound questions long before they might normally encounter them. "I hear uncertainty," Yamamoto said finally. "The sea knows that tomorrow may bring great changes. Do you think we'll encounter American aircraft?" "Almost certainly. The question is whether we'll have enough warning to take defensive action." Yamamoto sipped his tea, feeling its warmth spread through his chest. "Tell me, Nakamura, do you have family back home?" "A mother and younger sister in Osaka. My sister wants to become a nurse." The young man's voice carried a mixture of pride and worry. "I send most of my pay home to help with her schooling. A noble goal. Japan will lead skilled nurses when this war ends." "When it ends, Captain? Not if?" Yamamoto considered the question carefully. It was the kind of conversation that could be construed as defeatist if reported to the wrong authorities, but something about the quiet intimacy of the night watch made such caution seem less important. "All wars end eventually, Nakamura. The question is what kind of nation we'll be when the fighting stops. Your sister's desire to heal rather than harm suggests that not all of our people have forgotten the value of compassion." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, 2 men sharing a moment of peace in the midst of humanity's greatest conflict. Finally, Nakamura spoke again. "Captain, Do you think the Americans are truly as savage as the propaganda suggests? Do they really have no honor? It was the question that had been haunting Yamamoto since his conversation with Admiral Kusaka. I've never met an American, Nakamura, but I've read their literature, studied their history. They claim to value many of the same things we do: loyalty, courage, protection of the innocent. Whether those values survive the pressures of war? I shrug. Perhaps we'll find out soon enough. The second day dawned gray and humid, with low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down on the convoy like a heavy blanket. Captain Yamamoto had managed only a few hours of fitful sleep before returning to the bridge at 0500. The routine morning reports painted a picture of a convoy functioning smoothly, engines running well, no mechanical problems, formation maintaining proper spacing. Yet tension hung in the air like the oppressive humidity. Every man aboard knew they were entering the most dangerous phase of their journey. Radar contact, the call from the crow's nest, sent a jolt of electricity through the bridge. Aircraft, bearing 350, range approximately 15 kilometers. Yamamoto grabbed his binoculars and trained them on the northern horizon. There, barely visible against the gray sky, were three dark specks that could only be aircraft. American aircraft.
General quarters. The alarm bells began their urgent clanging throughout the ship. All hands to battle stations! Within minutes, the Kobe Maru's defensive positions were manned. The ship carried 4 25mm anti-aircraft guns and 2 heavy machine guns, modest armament for a merchant vessel, but every bit of defensive firepower could make the difference between life and death. Signal from escort commander, reported Ensign Hayashi from the communications station. All ships to maintain formation and prepare for air attack. Fighter cover dispatched, but will not arrive for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Yamamoto felt his stomach tighten. In 20 minutes, enemy aircraft could make multiple attack runs, launch torpedoes, drop bombs, and disappear back to their bases. The convoy would have to survive on its own defensive firepower and whatever evasive maneuvers they could manage while maintaining formation. The aircraft were closer now, close enough that Yamamoto could make out their distinctive silhouettes through his binoculars. American TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, flying in a loose formation that suggested they were preparing to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. "Range 8 kilometers and closing," called the lookout. The lead destroyer, Yukikaze, had increased speed and was maneuvering to place herself between the convoy and the approaching aircraft. Her anti-aircraft guns were trained skyward, waiting for the Americans to come within range. "They're splitting up," Yamamoto observed, watching the enemy formation divide into 3 separate attack groups, one group for each column of the convoy. It was a professional approach, he had to admit. The American pilots were taking no chances, ensuring that their attack would be coordinated and difficult to defend against. Whatever else one might say about them, they had clearly learned from their early war experiences. The first shots came from Yukikaze's main battery, her 5-inch guns sending up puffs of black smoke in the sky ahead of the leading American aircraft. The range was still too great for accuracy, but the destroyer was laying down a defensive barrier, forcing the attackers to fly through a gauntlet of exploding shells. "All guns, commence firing when targets are in range," Yamamoto ordered. Around the convoy, the other merchant vessels were taking similar defensive postures, their limited armament adding to the growing wall of anti-aircraft fire. The American pilots proved to be both skilled and determined. Instead of approaching in a predictable straight line, they wove between the defensive fire, using cloud cover and the convoy's own smoke to mask their approach. Yamamoto found himself grudgingly admiring their technique, even as he watched them line up for their attack runs. "Torpedo in the water!" The shout came from multiple lookouts simultaneously. The lead Avenger had dropped its weapon at maximum range, the torpedo entering the water with a splash that sent up a column of white spray. "Hard to starboard!" Yamamoto called to the helmsman. The Hakone Maru began her turn, but with a full cargo load, she responded sluggishly to the wheel. The torpedo's wake was visible now, a straight white line cutting through the water directly toward their position. For long seconds, it seemed as though the torpedo would find its mark. The crew on deck watched in fascination and terror as the weapon approached, its wake growing larger and more distinct. Then, at the last possible moment, the Hakone Maru's turn brought her clear. The torpedo passed harmlessly down the starboard side, its momentum carrying it beyond the convoy formation.
But the Americans weren't finished. The second group of attackers had used the distraction of the first torpedo run to position themselves for a bombing attack on the convoy's center column. Yamamoto watched in horror as the lead bomber lined up on the transport Akagi Maru, loaded with medical supplies and food for the garrison at Bougainville. The bombs fell in a tight pattern, their distinctive whistle growing louder as they approached their target. The first two missed, sending up towering columns of water that soaked the Akagi Maru's deck. The third struck her amidships, the explosion tearing through her hull and sending a pillar of flame and smoke into the gray sky. "Signal from Akagi Maru," Ensign Hayashi reported, his voice tight with tension. "She's taken serious damage and is beginning to list." Through his binoculars, Yamamoto could see figures moving on the damaged transport's deck. Her crew was already preparing to abandon ship, knowing that a vessel with a broken hull and fires burning in her cargo holds was doomed. It was a decision that took tremendous courage to voluntarily enter the water in the middle of the Pacific, with enemy aircraft still circling overhead. The third group of American attackers had been waiting for just such an opportunity. As the Akagi Maru's crew began lowering lifeboats, the remaining Avengers banked around for what appeared to be a final strafing run. "They're going after the lifeboats," Lieutenant Matsui said quietly, disbelief evident in his voice. Yamamoto focused his binoculars on the scene unfolding less than a kilometer away. The Akagi Maru was settling by the bow, her crew abandoning ship in good order despite the circumstances. 3 lifeboats had been successfully launched, with perhaps 30 men aboard. The survivors were rowing desperately away from their sinking vessel, seeking to put distance between themselves and the enemy cargo still burning in her holds. The American aircraft approached in a shallow dive, their machine guns already chattering. But instead of targeting the sinking ship or the convoy's remaining vessels, they were firing at the lifeboats. The water around the small craft erupted in splashes as .5 caliber bullets tore through the air. One of the lifeboats splintered under the concentrated fire, throwing its occupants into the sea. The survivors in the other boats crouched low, some diving overboard to escape the strafing attack. "My God," whispered radioman Nakamura, who had joined the bridge crew to coordinate communications. "They're murdering survivors!" For a moment, the entire bridge crew stood frozen in shock. This was beyond their experience, beyond their understanding of how war was supposed to be conducted. Attacking enemy warships, sinking cargo vessels, even bombing military installations, these were the accepted practices of warfare. But deliberately targeting sailors who had already abandoned their ship, men who posed no threat to anyone? "Continue evasive maneuvers," Yamamoto ordered, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. But his eyes remained fixed on the scene of slaughter unfolding in the convoy's wake. The Akagi Maru's pilots made 2 more strafing passes before departing, leaving behind a debris field of broken wood, scattered supplies, and men struggling to survive in the oil-slicked water. "Signal from escort commander," Ensign Hayashi reported. "We are to maintain course and speed. No vessels will be detached for rescue operations."
It was a logical decision, Yamamoto knew. Stopping the convoy to pick up survivors would leave them vulnerable to submarine attack, and there was no guarantee that more American aircraft wouldn't arrive to continue the assault. The needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few. It was cold military calculus, the kind of decision that won wars.
But as he watched the tiny figures in the water grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely, something fundamental shifted in Captain Yamamoto's understanding of this conflict. The Americans had crossed a line. Whatever justification they might offer for their actions, revenge for Pearl Harbor, the necessities of war, the pressure of combat, they had deliberately chosen to slaughter helpless men who posed no military threat. They had abandoned the basic principles of honor that had governed warfare between civilized nations. "Nakamura," he called to the young radio man, "make note of our position, time, and the details of what we've witnessed. This incident will be reported to Naval Command upon our return to port." "Yes, sir. What classification should I give the report?" Yamamoto considered the question. What they had witnessed was more than a simple battle report. It was evidence of a fundamental change in the nature of this war, proof that the Americans had embraced a savage approach to warfare that made no distinction between combatants and survivors. "Classification? War crimes," he said quietly. "And make sure the report includes every detail, the number of lifeboats, the approximate number of survivors, and the specific actions taken by enemy aircraft." The remainder of the day passed without further incident, but the atmosphere aboard the Convoy had changed dramatically. News of the Akagi Maru's fate and the subsequent attack on her survivors spread quickly through the fleet, carried by signal lamp and whispered conversations during watch changes. That evening, as the convoy approached the waters north of Bougainville, Yamamoto called his senior officers together for a briefing. The ship's tiny wardroom felt cramped, with 5 men gathered around the fold-down table, charts and navigation instruments competing for space with teacups and ashtrays. "Gentlemen," Yamamoto began, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there the previous day. "What we witnessed today changes everything. We are no longer fighting an enemy who recognizes the basic laws of warfare. The Americans have chosen to embrace savagery." Chief Engineer Sato, a man whose 43 years included service in the Russo-Japanese War, shook his head slowly. "In my experience, Captain, desperate enemies often abandon honor in favor of effectiveness. But this seemed deliberate, calculated. The American pilots had already sunk the Akagi Maru. Their mission was accomplished. There was no military necessity for attacking the survivors. Which brings us to our current situation. We must assume that if our convoy comes under attack and we are forced to abandon ship, we cannot expect any mercy from American forces. They have demonstrated their willingness to murder helpless survivors." The implications of this reality settled over the wardroom like a dark cloud. Every man present understood that their chances of survival had just decreased dramatically. In previous convoy attacks, sailors had at least been able to take comfort in the knowledge that abandoning ship might save their lives, even if it meant spending time in American prisoner of war camps. That option had apparently been removed. "Sir?" Radio man Nakamura spoke up hesitantly. "Should we inform the crew of what we observed?"
It was a difficult question. The men deserved to know what they might face, but such knowledge could also undermine morale and fighting efficiency. Fear of capture or death had always been part of a sailor's life, but fear of deliberate murder after surrender was something else entirely. "We'll inform the section leaders," Yamamoto decided. "Let them use their judgment about how much to share with their men. Some of our crew are very young, and this knowledge might affect their ability to perform their duties." "Captain," Chief Sato interjected, "there's another consideration. If the Americans are willing to murder survivors, how should we respond if we encounter American survivors? Do we follow their example, or do we maintain our honor?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. It cut to the heart of what separated civilized warfare from mere slaughter, what distinguished soldiers from murderers. Yamamoto felt the weight of command settle more heavily on his shoulders. "We will continue to conduct ourselves according to Japanese naval traditions," he said firmly.
If we encounter American survivors, they will be treated according to international law and the dictates of honor. We will not lower ourselves to their level. Even if they show us no such mercy? Especially if they show us no such mercy. Honor isn't conditional on reciprocity, Chief. It's what separates us from animals. The meeting continued for another hour, covering tactical considerations, emergency procedures, and contingency plans. But underneath all the professional discussion lay a new understanding of the stakes involved. They were no longer simply carrying supplies to a distant garrison. They were carrying the honor of the Imperial Navy through waters where honor had apparently been abandoned by their enemies. As night fell and the convoy continued its northward course, Yamamoto found himself back at his usual position on the bridge wing. The familiar rhythm of the ship's passage through dark water was somehow comforting, a reminder of the eternal nature of seamanship that transcended the temporary madness of war. "Captain," Nakamura approached with the evening communications report. "Signal from Naval Command. Enemy submarine activity reported in our destination area. We're to maintain extra vigilance." "Understood. Any word on fighter cover for tomorrow's approach?" "Limited availability, sir. Most of our aircraft are committed to the defense of Rabaul itself." So they would face the final approach with minimal air cover, sailing into waters that were probably crawling with American submarines and within range of multiple enemy airfields. Under normal circumstances, it would be a daunting enough challenge. Now, with the knowledge that surrender might mean death rather than imprisonment, it seemed almost suicidal. "Young," Yamamoto said quietly, "do you still have that picture of your sister?" The young radio man smiled and pulled a worn photograph from his shirt pocket. It showed a girl of perhaps 16, wearing a school uniform and smiling shyly at the camera.
"Hiroko," Nakamura said. "This was taken just before I left for my current assignment." "She has kind eyes," Yamamoto observed. "The kind of person who will make an excellent nurse." "I hope so, sir. I hope she has the chance." They both understood the implication. If the convoy was lost, if none of them survived to return home, Hiroko Nakamura would lose her brother and her means of support in a single stroke. Her dreams of becoming a nurse might die with him in these hostile waters. "She'll have her chance," Yamamoto said with more confidence than he felt. "We're going to get through this, Nakamura. All of us." But even as he spoke the words, he could see the young man's doubt reflected in his own heart. The Americans had changed the rules of engagement, transforming the Pacific into a theater where mercy was a luxury and honor a potential death sentence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their ability to maintain their humanity in the face of inhuman opposition. Tonight, all they could do was hold their course and hope that somehow honor might still matter in a world that seemed increasingly determined to abandon it. Dawn of the third day brought clear skies and calm seas, perfect conditions for both navigation and enemy air attacks. Captain Yamamoto had spent most of the night on the bridge, dozing fitfully in his seat while maintaining oversight of the convoy's progress. They were now less than 50 kilometers from their destination, close enough that the mountains of Bougainville were visible on the horizon as a dark smudge against the morning sky. "Morning reports, sir." Lieutenant Matsui handed Yamamoto a clipboard with the overnight summaries from each section of the ship. "Engine room, operating normally. Communications, no enemy radio intercepts detected. Lookouts, several unidentified radar contacts during the night, but none had approached within visual range." "What about the other ships in the convoy?" "All vessels report ready to proceed. The Nishin Maru experienced some engine difficulties around midnight, but Chief Engineer Yamamoto reports they've been resolved." Matsui paused, consulting his notes. "The escort commander requests a meeting of all ship captains at 0800 to discuss final approach procedures." The meeting took place aboard the destroyer Yukikaze,
with the merchant captains transported by launch to the warship's sleek hull. Captain Yamamoto found himself seated around a table with 11 other convoy commanders, men whose faces showed the strain of 3 days under constant threat of attack. Commander Ishida, the escort leader, was a career naval officer whose destroyer had already survived more than a dozen convoy missions. His weathered features and prematurely gray hair testified to the stress of guiding merchant vessels through increasingly hostile waters. "Gentlemen," Ishida began without preamble, "we are approaching the most dangerous phase of our mission. Intelligence reports suggest that American submarine activity in our destination waters has increased significantly over the past week. Additionally, enemy air patrols from Henderson Field are now ranging farther north than previously observed." He gestured to a chart spread on the table, marked with red symbols indicating known or suspected enemy positions. The final 50 kilometers of their journey would take them through a gauntlet of potential threats. "Our approach will be as follows. The convoy will maintain current formation until we reach Point Able here." His finger indicated a position roughly 30 kilometers from their destination. "At that point, we will divide into 3 separate groups, each taking a different approach route to the harbor. This will minimize our profile and reduce the chance that a single submarine attack can damage multiple vessels." It was sound tactical thinking, Yamamoto recognized. By splitting the convoy, they would force any lurking submarines to choose their targets carefully, potentially allowing most of the ships to reach port safely even if one group was attacked. "Questions?" Commander Ishida asked.
Captain Suzuki of the transport Kobe Maru raised his hand. "What about air cover for the final approach?" "Limited," Ishida admitted. "We'll have 2 Zero fighters available for the period between 1,000 and 1,200 hours. After that, you're on your own until local defense forces can provide coverage." 2 fighters to protect 12 merchant ships and 5 escorts across 50 kilometers of ocean. The mathematics of survival were not encouraging. "Sir," Yamamoto spoke up, "has Naval Command been informed about the American attacks on survivors that we witnessed yesterday?" The destroyer captain's expression darkened. "Yes, Captain Yamamoto. Your preliminary report has been forwarded to headquarters. I'm afraid similar incidents have been reported by other convoy survivors over the past month." A murmur of anger and dismay circulated around the table. So the attack on the Akagi Maru's lifeboats had not been an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of American brutality that was apparently becoming standard practice. "This changes our emergency procedures," Ishida continued grimly. "In the event that you are forced to abandon ship, do not expect mercy from enemy forces. Make every effort to reach friendly territory rather than surrendering to American units." The meeting concluded with detailed timing instructions for the approach to Bougainville. Each captain received updated charts showing the specific route his vessel would take, along with recognition signals for friendly forces and emergency communication procedures. As the launches returned the merchant captains to their respective ships, Yamamoto found himself sharing a boat with Captain Hashimoto of the oil tanker Kobe Maru. Hashimoto was one of the most experienced convoy commanders in the fleet, a man whose ship had successfully completed more than 20 supply runs despite carrying the most volatile and dangerous cargo. "Captain Yamamoto," Hashimoto said quietly, ensuring their conversation could not be overheard by the launch crew. "What do you think of our chances?" "Honestly, I think we're sailing into a trap." Yamamoto watched the Kobe Maru grow larger as they approached. "The Americans know our destination, they know our approximate timing, and they have the forces in position to intercept us. Then why proceed? Why not request permission to turn back?" It was a reasonable question, one that Yamamoto had been asking himself since the previous day's attack. The logical answer was that the supplies they carried were desperately needed by Japanese forces on Bougainville, that the strategic situation required them to accept enormous risks in order to maintain their positions in the Solomon Islands. But there was another answer, one that went deeper than military necessity. Because if we turn back every time the Americans demonstrate their savagery, we concede that terror works. We abandon our own people to starvation and defeat because we're afraid to face an enemy who has abandoned honor. Hashimoto nodded slowly. "Honor. Yes, I suppose that's what it comes down to, isn't it? The question is whether honor is worth dying for when your enemy has no concept of what it means. Honor isn't about what the enemy does, Captain. It's about what we do. What we choose to do, even when, especially when, we're facing an enemy who has abandoned civilized behavior. Back aboard the Kobe Maru, Yamamoto briefed his officers on the final approach plan. The ship would be part of the second group, approaching the harbor from the northwest, while the other two groups created diversions to the east and south.
Sir, Chief Engineer Sato interjected during the briefing. I should mention that we're running lower on fuel than I'd prefer for these kinds of evasive maneuvers. If we encounter heavy opposition and need to make high-speed runs, we might find ourselves with limited options. How much do we have? Enough for normal operations through tomorrow evening. If we're forced to run at flank speed for extended periods, we could be down to fumes by sunset. Another variable to consider in an already complex equation. Yamamoto made a mental note to discuss fuel conservation with the helmsman and to ensure that all non-essential systems were secured to preserve power for critical operations. At 0930 hours, the convoy reached Point Able and began its planned division into 3 groups. The Kobe Maru found herself in company with 3 other merchant vessels and the corvette Hatsuyuki, watching as the other groups peeled away to take their separate routes toward their assigned approach routes. The separation felt ominous to Yamamoto, like watching a family scatter before a storm. For 3 days, the convoy had moved as a unified force, each ship drawing strength from the presence of the others. Now they were alone with just 4 vessels and a single escort, heading into the most dangerous waters of their journey. Signal from Hatsuyuki, Ensign Hayashi reported. Maintain course 270, speed 12 knots. Radio silence until further notice. The small formation settled into its final approach, the tension aboard each vessel almost palpable. Every man knew that the next few hours would determine whether they lived or died, whether their cargo would reach the desperate soldiers on Bougainville or join the countless tons of supplies already resting on the Pacific floor. Yamamoto positioned himself on the bridge wing with his binoculars, scanning the horizon for any sign of enemy activity. The morning was beautiful in the way that only the tropical Pacific could be, crystal clear water stretching to every horizon, scattered white clouds providing occasional patches of shade, a gentle breeze that barely ruffled the ocean's surface. It was the kind of morning that, in peacetime, would have filled him with joy at the simple pleasure of being at sea. Now that same clarity and beauty worked against them, providing perfect visibility for enemy submarines and aircraft. Radar contact! The call from the Hatsuyuki signal lamp sent a chill through every man in the small formation. Multiple aircraft, bearing 090, range 20 kilometers, and closing. Here they came. Yamamoto felt his stomach tighten as he trained his binoculars toward the east. There, a formation of dark specks against the morning sky, growing larger with each passing second. General quarters, all hands to battle stations! The alarm rang throughout the Kobe Maru as her crew rushed to their defensive positions. But this time there was a difference in their movement, a grim determination that hadn't been there at the beginning of the voyage. These men had seen what American aircraft did to survivors. They knew that surrender was not an option. 12 aircraft, Lieutenant Matsui reported from the bridge, appears to be a mixed formation, torpedo bombers and fighters. 12 enemy aircraft, against 4 merchant ships and 1 corvette. The mathematics were not encouraging, but Yamamoto had been in worse situations. The key was to make the Americans pay dearly for whatever success they achieved.
The Hatsuyuki was already maneuvering to place herself between the convoy and the approaching aircraft, her anti-aircraft guns training skyward. Smoke began pouring from her stacks as her crew prepared for high-speed evasive action. All ships commence independent evasive maneuvers, came the signal from the corvette. Maintain general course toward objective. The formation began to spread out, each vessel taking its own zigzag pattern designed to make torpedo attacks more difficult.
Yamamoto watched the American aircraft separate into two groups. 6 torpedo bombers heading directly for the merchant ships, 6 fighters climbing to provide cover and strafe any vessel that survived the initial attack. "Range 5 kilometers," called the lookout. The Hatsuyuki opened fire, her 3-inch gun sending up puffs of black smoke in the sky ahead of the attackers. The range was still extreme, but the corvette was laying down a defensive barrage, forcing the enemy pilots to fly through exploding shells to reach their targets. Yamamoto found himself admiring the American formation flying, even as they approached to attack his convoy. The pilots maintained perfect intervals, adjusted their approach to account for the defensive fire, and showed no sign of hesitation despite the anti-aircraft barrage. Whatever else one might say about them, they were professionals. "Torpedo in the water!" Multiple lookouts called the warning simultaneously. The lead American bomber had released its weapon at maximum range, the torpedo entering the sea with its characteristic splash and wake. But this pilot had made the same mistake that many attackers made. He had aimed for where the target was, not where it would be when the torpedo arrived. "Hard to port," Yamamoto called to the helmsman. The Akagi Maru began her turn, her crew working frantically to bring their anti-aircraft weapons to bear on the attackers. The 25mm guns opened fire, their characteristic rapid-fire chatter adding to the crescendo of defensive fire rising from the small convoy. 2 more torpedoes entered the water, both from bombers attacking the transport Nishin Maru. One of them appeared to be running true, its wake heading directly for the cargo vessel's midship section. But the Nishin Maru's captain had learned from 3 days of convoy operations. His ship was already in a hard turn to starboard, black smoke pouring from her stack as her engine room crew pushed the old vessel to her maximum speed. The torpedo passed harmlessly astern, its wake visible for several hundred meters before the weapon ran out of fuel and sank. The American fighters were making their presence felt now, diving on the convoy with machine guns blazing. Streams of .5 caliber bullets lashed the water around the merchant vessels, forcing deck crews to take cover behind whatever protection they could find. One of the fighters concentrated on the Akagi Maru's bridge, its bullets shattering windows and sending splinters of wood and metal flying through the enclosed space. Yamamoto felt something tug at his sleeve and looked down to see a bullet hole in his uniform jacket, less than an inch from his arm. "Captain," Nakamura called from the communication station, "the Nishin Maru reports she's taken damage to her steering gear." Through his binoculars, Yamamoto could see the transport beginning to swing in an uncontrolled circle, her rudder apparently jammed by the strafing attack. Without steering, she would be unable to maintain course or evade further attacks, a sitting duck for any American pilot who chose to finish her off.
But something remarkable happened. Instead of pressing their attack on the helpless transport, the American aircraft began to withdraw. They had expended their torpedoes and most of their ammunition in the initial assault, and rather than continuing to strafe the damaged vessel, they formed up and headed back toward their base. "They're leaving," Lieutenant Matsui said in amazement. "They're actually leaving." Yamamoto lowered his binoculars, equally surprised. In his experience, American pilots usually pressed their attacks until they had either sunk their targets or exhausted their ammunition completely. This restraint was unexpected. "Signal from Hatsuyuki," Ensign Hayashi reported. "Form up on the corvette for final approach to harbor. Nishin Maru to proceed independently as able." The damaged transport was already falling behind, her crew working frantically to repair the steering damage. But she was still afloat, still making way toward their destination, albeit slowly and without the ability to maneuver effectively. As the reduced convoy continued toward Bougainville, Yamamoto found himself puzzling over the American pilots' behavior. They had achieved tactical surprise, damaged one vessel, but then withdrawn without pressing their advantage. It was almost as if— "Captain," Nakamura interrupted his thoughts. "Message from Nishin Maru. They report that during the strafing attack, they observed one of the American fighters deliberately avoid targeting their lifeboats." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. These weren't the same pilots who had strafed the Akagi Maru's survivors 2 days earlier. This was a different squadron, different men with different standards.
The American military, like any large organization, contained individuals with varying degrees of honor and humanity. Some American pilots were willing to murder helpless survivors. Others, like the ones they had just encountered, still maintained some vestige of military honor. The realization was both disturbing and oddly comforting. Disturbing because it meant that encounters with American forces had become a deadly lottery. Comforting because it suggested that not all of their enemies had abandoned basic human decency. Signal visual contact with harbor entrance, came the call from the crow's nest. There, barely visible through the morning haze, were the familiar landmarks that marked the approach to their destination. They had made it. Against all odds, through submarine-infested waters and repeated air attacks, 3 of the 4 ships in their group would deliver their desperately needed cargo to the Japanese garrison. The harbor entrance was heavily fortified, with multiple anti-aircraft gun positions clearly visible on the surrounding hills. Several Japanese patrol craft emerged to escort the convoy through the defensive minefields, their crews waving greetings to the merchant sailors who had risked everything to bring them supplies. As the Hakone Maru approached the dock, Yamamoto could see soldiers waiting on the pier. Thin, tired-looking men whose faces showed the strain of months under siege. These were the people for whom they had risked their lives, the reason why honor still mattered in a war that seemed increasingly determined to abandon it. Mooring lines secured, Chief Engineer Sato reported from the deck. We're alongside, Captain. The first officer of the harbor facility came aboard within minutes of their docking, a young lieutenant whose enthusiasm barely masked his obvious relief at seeing fresh supplies arrive. Captain Yamamoto? Lieutenant Sasaki, Harbor Operations. Welcome to Bougainville, sir. I can't tell you how glad we are to see you. Thank you, Lieutenant. What's our unloading schedule? We'll begin immediately, sir. My men will work around the clock to get your cargo ashore. The garrison commander wants to meet with you as soon as possible. There are questions about your voyage and... He hesitated. There are reports that need to be made.
That evening, after the exhausting process of cargo transfer had been completed, Yamamoto found himself in the garrison commander's modest headquarters. Colonel Tanaka was a career Army officer whose premature baldness and deep-lined face testified to the stress of commanding an isolated outpost in the middle of a war zone. "Captain," Tanaka began, pouring tea from a ceramic pot that had somehow survived months of bombardment. "Your supplies arrived at a critical time. We were down to less than a week's worth of medical supplies, and our ammunition reserves were dangerously low." "I'm glad we could help, Colonel. My crew will be ready to depart with any return cargo tomorrow evening." "About that," Tanaka's expression grew troubled. "I'm afraid your return voyage may be even more dangerous than your arrival. Our intelligence indicates that American submarine activity has increased dramatically over the past few days. It's almost as if they're establishing a blockade of our supply routes." Yamamoto sipped his tea, considering the implications. If the Americans were indeed positioning submarines to intercept return convoys, the mathematics of survival became even more challenging. "There's something else, Captain. Your report about American aircraft attacking survivors. We've received similar accounts from other convoy commanders. The pattern appears to be systematic, suggesting that this is now official American policy rather than the actions of individual pilots." "Not entirely, Colonel. During today's attack, we observed at least one American pilot deliberately avoiding civilian targets. There appears to be some variation in behavior between different units." "Not entirely, Colonel. During today's attack, we observed at least one American pilot deliberately avoiding civilian targets. There appears to be some variation in behavior between different units." Tanaka nodded thoughtfully. "Which makes the situation even more dangerous in some ways. If we could count on consistent brutality from American forces, we could plan accordingly. But this randomness, some units showing mercy, others committing murder, makes it impossible to predict how any given encounter will unfold." They discussed logistics and timing for the return voyage, but both men understood that the real topic of conversation was honor, how to maintain it in the face of an enemy whose behavior had become unpredictable and, in some cases, savage. The return voyage began at sunset, with Akagi Maru and her surviving convoy mates slipping out of the harbor under cover of darkness. They carried wounded soldiers, dispatches for naval command, and, most importantly, detailed reports of what they had witnessed during their journey. The first night passed without incident, but Yamamoto found sleep elusive. He stood on the bridge wing, watching the phosphorescent wake of their small formation, thinking about the changed nature of warfare and what it meant for men like his crew. "Captain," Nakamura approached with a message form in his hand. "Priority signal from Naval Command. American submarine reported in our path, approximately 100 kilometers southeast of our current position." 100 kilometers. At their current speed, they would reach that area sometime tomorrow afternoon. Yamamoto studied the chart, noting the water depth and surrounding geography. If American submarines were indeed positioning submarines to intercept return convoys, that location would be ideal for intercepting returning convoys. "Plot a course that takes us 50 kilometers north of the reported position. Signal the other ships with the course change."
The detour would add several hours to their journey and bring them closer to American air bases, but avoiding a known submarine threat seemed prudent. As dawn approached, Yamamoto called his officers together for a final briefing. "Gentlemen," he began, "today we face what may be our greatest challenge. The Americans appear to be changing their tactics, moving from opportunistic attacks to systematic interdiction of our supply routes. We must assume that they know our approximate position and timing." "Sir," Lieutenant Matsui spoke up, "our fuel reserves are lower than I'd prefer for extended evasive maneuvers if we encounter heavy opposition." "I understand. We'll have to be selective about when and how we respond to threats." Yamamoto looked around the table at his officers, good men who had served with him through multiple dangerous voyages. "I want everyone to understand something. What we witnessed during our outbound journey, the deliberate targeting of survivors, changes the fundamental nature of our situation." "In what way, Captain?" Chief Engineer Sato asked. "It means that our primary obligation is no longer just to complete our mission or save our ship. Our primary obligation is to ensure that at least some of us survive to report what we've seen. The Japanese people need to know how their enemies are choosing to fight this war." The implications settled over the wardroom like a dark cloud. They were no longer just merchant sailors carrying cargo between friendly ports. They had become witnesses to war crimes, carriers of information that might influence how Japan conducted the remainder of the conflict. At 1400 hours, the dreaded call came from the lookout. "Periscope sighted, bearing 270, range approximately 800 meters. Yamamoto rushed to the bridge wing with his binoculars. There, barely visible above the surface, was the telltale feather of white water that marked a submarine periscope. The American boat had positioned itself perfectly to intercept their convoy, lying in wait like a predator at a watering hole. "Emergency turn to starboard, all ahead full." The Akagi Maru heeled over as she began her evasive turn, her engine room crew pushing the machinery to maximum power. Around them, the other vessels of their small convoy were executing similar maneuvers, each ship zigging and zagging in an attempt to avoid the inevitable torpedo attack. "Torpedo wake in the water!" The lookout's call sent a chill through every man on the bridge. The submarine had fired, and now it was simply a matter of mathematics. Would their evasive maneuvers be sufficient to avoid the American weapon? The torpedo wake was clearly visible, a straight white line cutting through the blue water directly toward their position. For long seconds, it seemed as though the weapon would find its mark. Then, at the last possible moment, their emergency turn brought the Akagi Maru clear. The torpedo passed harmlessly down their port side, its momentum carrying it well beyond the convoy.
But American submarines typically carried more than one torpedo, and the enemy commander had apparently learned from his first shot. The second torpedo was fired at shorter range, with less time for the target to maneuver. This one struck the transport Kobe Maru amidships, the explosion sending a column of water and debris high into the air. Through his binoculars, Yamamoto could see that the cargo vessel was mortally wounded, her hull cracked open and water pouring into her holds. "Signal from Kobe Maru," Ensign Hayashi reported grimly. "She's abandoning ship." And there it was, the moment that would define everything that followed. The Kobe Maru's crew was launching lifeboats, following standard procedures for abandoning a sinking vessel. In a few minutes, perhaps 40 men would be floating helplessly in small boats, completely at the mercy of whoever chose to approach them. Would the American submarines surface to take prisoners? Would they simply leave the survivors to fend for themselves? Or would they follow the example of their air forces and deliberately target the helpless men in the lifeboats? "Captain," Lieutenant Matsui said quietly, "orders from the escort commander. We are to maintain course and speed. No vessels will be detached for rescue operations." It was the same order they had received 2 days earlier, when the Akagi Maru survivors had been strafed by American aircraft. Military logic demanded that the convoy continue its mission rather than risk additional vessels in rescue operations. But this time was different. This time, Yamamoto had a choice to make that would define not only his own honor, but the honor of every man under his command. "Belay that order," he said quietly. "Signal the engine room. All stop." "Sir," Matsui's voice carried a note of alarm, "the escort commander specifically ordered—" "I heard the order, Lieutenant, and I am choosing to disobey it." Yamamoto turned to face his officers. "Signal the other ships to continue on course. The Hakone Maru will remain behind to pick up survivors." "Captain," Chief Engineer Sato protested, "if the submarine is still in the area, then we'll deal with that threat when it materializes. But I will not leave Japanese sailors to drown or be murdered by Americans because it's militarily convenient." The decision sent a ripple of shock through the bridge crew. Disobeying direct orders from a superior officer was a court-martial offense under the best circumstances. Doing so in the face of enemy action could be considered mutiny. But as Yamamoto watched his crew, he saw something unexpected in their faces. Not fear or disapproval, but relief. These men had been struggling with the same moral conflict that had been tearing at him since the beginning of their voyage. They had watched helpless survivors being murdered, had been ordered to abandon their own comrades to save themselves, had been asked to compromise their fundamental values in the name of military necessity. Now their captain was telling them that honor still mattered, that some principles were worth risking everything to uphold. "All back 1/3, Yamamoto ordered. "Bring us alongside the lifeboats." The Hakone Maru began to maneuver toward the survivors, her crew preparing lines and rescue equipment. In the distance, the rest of their convoy continued toward home, following orders and military logic. Here, one ship and her crew were choosing a different path. The rescue operation took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every man aboard the Hakone Maru knew that they were vulnerable while dead in the water, picking up survivors. If the American submarine chose to attack again, they would be an easy target. But the attack never came. Either the submarine commander had expended his torpedoes, or he was unwilling to target a vessel engaged in rescue operations. Whatever his reasoning, he allowed the Hakone Maru to complete her humanitarian mission unmolested. 43 survivors from the Kobe Maru were pulled aboard, men who had resigned themselves to death in the water or at American hands. Their gratitude was overwhelming, but Yamamoto deflected their thanks with characteristic modesty. "Any Japanese sailor would have done the same," he told the Kobe Maru's captain as they got the rescued officer into dry clothes. "No, Captain Yamamoto, not every sailor would have made that choice. You risked your ship and your crew to save men who were already as good as dead. That is the definition of honor." The Hakone Maru reached port 3 days later, her hull crowded with survivors from 2 sunken vessels, and her hold filled with reports that would change how Japan understood its enemies.
Captain Yamamoto's decision to disobey orders and conduct rescue operations resulted in a formal investigation, but the court-martial proceedings were quietly dropped when the full scope of American war crimes became clear. The reports filed by surviving convoy commanders documented a systematic pattern of attacks on survivors, deliberate targeting of hospital ships, and other violations of international law. These accounts became part of Japan's formal protest to neutral nations and influenced military policy for the remainder of the war. But for Yamamoto and his crew, the most important outcome was not political or military. It was the knowledge that they had maintained their honor in the face of an enemy who had largely abandoned theirs. They had proven that principles could survive the pressure of total war, that mercy and humanity were not luxuries to be discarded when survival was at stake. Radioman Nakamura received a letter from his sister 3 weeks after their return. She had been accepted into nursing school and wanted to dedicate her career to treating wounded soldiers, both Japanese and American. Her brother's stories of maintaining honor in the face of brutality had inspired her to choose healing over hatred. Chief Engineer Sato was promoted and given command of his own vessel, carrying on the tradition of merchant mariners who put duty and honor above personal survival. Lieutenant Matsui became one of Japan's most experienced convoy navigators, using his skills to guide supply ships through increasingly dangerous waters. And Captain Yamamoto? He continued to command merchant vessels until the war's end, participating in 17 more convoy missions and saving the lives of over 200 survivors from sunken ships. His crews knew that sailing with Yamamoto meant they might face greater risks. He would never abandon fellow sailors to satisfy military convenience. But it also meant they were serving under a commander who understood that some things were more important than victory. Years later, when historians studied the Pacific War, they would note that both sides committed atrocities, that the pressures of total war led many men to abandon the civilized conventions of warfare. But they would also note that some individuals, on both sides, chose to maintain their humanity even when surrounded by inhumanity. Captain Takeshi Yamamoto and the crew of the Hakone Maru represented the best of what human beings could be, even in the worst circumstances. Their story serves as a reminder that honor is not about how others behave, it's about how we choose to behave, regardless of what others do. In a war that saw the abandonment of many principles, they kept the last honor. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through The Last Honor. This story of courage, moral conviction, and humanity in the darkest circumstances represents the kind of deep, character-driven historical fiction that I am passionate about creating.
If this story moved you, if Captain Yamamoto's struggle between duty and honor resonated with you, or if you simply enjoyed this deep dive into the moral complexities of warfare, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your subscription helps me continue crafting these detailed, researched stories that explore the human side of history. What did you think of Captain Yamamoto's decision to risk everything to save survivors? Were there moments that particularly stood out to you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to be the first to experience my next historical epic. I have more stories planned that will take you to different theaters of war, different time periods, and different moral dilemmas that test what it truly means to be human. Share this story with anyone who appreciates thoughtful historical fiction, and remember, the best stories are the ones that make us examine our own values and choices. Until next time, keep exploring the depths of human courage and conviction. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next epic tale.